Welcome to the 700 Club. Weaponizing the Justice Department to intimidate parents. That's the accusation Senate Republicans brought against Attorney General Merrick Garland yesterday as they hammered him in congressional hearings.
The Attorney General doubled down on his controversial memo. He also refused to disband a task force to investigate possible threats against school board members. Tara Mergener reports from Washington.
GOP lawmakers are among those accusing Garland of calling parents domestic terrorists. Garland says he never used those words when asking the Justice Department to look into threats of violence.
Did you consider the chilling effect that this sort of threat of federal prosecution would have on parents' exercise of their constitutional rights to be involved in their children's education?
Pushing back at pointed criticism from Republicans, Attorney General Merrick Garland defending his memo, asking the Justice Department to respond to threats aimed at school officials.
I don't believe it's reasonable to read this memorandum as chilling anyone's rights. It's about threats of violence, and it expressly recognizes the constitutional right to make arguments about your children's education.
Garland's memo followed one by the National School Board Association asking the feds to step in and included a reference to domestic terrorism. While the group has apologized, Garland has not. As this drama plays out, a protest not far from the Capitol. Moms for America and other organizations representing mothers from across the U.S.
And I take full offense to the NSBA and the DOJ referring to concerned parents like myself as domestic terrorists.
Demanding parents be included in curriculum and policy decisions like critical race theory.
CRT is also Marxist ideology. It is used to divide America and silence the oppression.
Meantime, tensions ran high at the Loudoun County School Board meeting Tuesday.
You have failed our students.
2 young ladies were scarred forever.
You were clearly aware of the sexual assault at Stonebridge.
Her life has forever been affected. I have lost almost all confidence I've had in this system that I have championed for so long.
Parents accusing Superintendent Scott Ziegler of covering up 2 sexual assaults by a 14-year-old student on school grounds and calling for Ziegler's and the board's resignation. The boy found guilty this week in the first case to be heard by a judge. Earlier this week, students staged a walkout.
Resign or be removed.
Shame on you.
Garland was confronted on this issue too. The victim's father arrested at a June school board meeting while trying to tell the school board what happened.
That refers to Scott Smith, whose 15-year-old daughter was raped. She was raped in a bathroom by a boy wearing girls' clothes, and the Loudoun County School Board covered it up because it would have interfered with their transgendered policy during Pride Month.
Development in Loudoun County, parents have been asked to sign a non-disclosure to see a new curriculum reportedly inspired by critical race theory. Gordon.
Tara, let's pick it up there. Why the non-disclosure agreement? What are they trying to keep secret?
That's a great question, because they've insisted all along that their equity plan is not critical race theory. As you know, that's been a huge controversy in Loudoun County and all around the country. So on its face, it would seem like they don't want parents to talk about whatever is contained in this plan. But I don't think they've got a good shot at that. I think those who read it are certainly going to talk about it.
Well, there ought to be a freedom of information request for it. I mean, this is a public school, and so anything in the curriculum is part of the public record. And if this is what they're contemplating, then they need to have full disclosure. Do you see any coincidence with the timing that there's an election coming up?
I don't think so. I think the timing is probably pretty intentional. You know, there's a lot of question of timing going on right now about everything that's going on. You know, as far as those hearings yesterday with Merrick Garland, the Republicans are questioning the timing of his memo, which came just a few days after the National Association of School Boards put out that memo comparing parents to domestic terrorists. And both Ted Cruz and Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas are both wondering whether the White House is calling the shots here, even though Garland promised that he would not politicize the Justice Department. So I think a lot of things having to do with the election, Gordon, probably no coincidence, but certainly some really fiery exchanges on Capitol Hill yesterday when it comes to Merrick Garland and what's happening with that memo and that domestic terror accusation by the NSBA, which, by the way, they've retracted that, and Garland, who is not taking back what he said about that, saying it has no bearing on the Justice Department.
Well, it's kind of curious timing, and to say it has no bearing when it comes days after receiving the request from the National Association of School Boards to do exactly what he ended up doing. It just it does kind of beg the question, why don't you just walk it back? Well, let's talk about Loudoun County and the superintendent, board members. A lot of calls for them to resign. Any signs of that actually happening?
You know, when the first school board member resigned, Beth Bartz, there was a lot of talk that a number would follow. Increasingly, calls for the superintendent, Scott Ziegler, are coming, including from one of the school board members, John Beatty, who has called him out and wants him to resign too. But as all this is going on behind the scenes, the school board member who resigned, Beth Bartz, is loud and clear on Facebook calling out John Beatty and possibly some other school board members, saying they all got that same memo about the sexual assault. So the thinking is, by people in the know out there, as more information comes out, it may pressure more school board members and ultimately the superintendent to resign. But at this point, my understanding is that everybody is holding firm while all this shakes out.
Well, I encourage parents, please hold firm. You have an absolute right to have a voice in your child's education. Well, Tara, thanks for the reporting, and we'll be tracking this as well. If you want to get more information, please download the CBN News app. We'll be tracking this story and its influence, I think it's obvious influence, on the upcoming election. Well, in other news, hurricane-force winds left more than 500,000 people without power in the Northeast, and tornadoes then pummeled Texas and Louisiana. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington.
Thanks, Gordon. The nor'easter that hit the region Wednesday knocked out power to about 600,000 homes and businesses. Crews now busy restoring service after hurricane-force winds, some near 100 miles an hour, swept parts of New England. Meanwhile, another system spawned dozens of tornadoes in parts of Texas and Louisiana. Officials say at least 100 homes there were damaged. And it's not over yet. Forecasters warn the Northeast to get ready for more heavy rainfall in the days ahead. Well, right here in Washington, Democrats reportedly have reached a framework agreement on President Biden's massive social spending bill at a cost somewhere between $1.7 and $1.9 trillion. The president is scheduled to meet with congressional Democrats this morning. Still, one item dear to progressives, paid family leave, appears to be out. And that's raising questions whether enough Democrats are on board to pass the president's trillion-dollar infrastructure plan. Some progressives say they will hold up infrastructure until they reach a final deal on the social spending bill. Well, controversy at the State Department over a policy that approves passports for people who don't identify as either male or female. As senior national affairs correspondent Heather Sells reports, some are pushing back against the transgender movement.
The State Department's historic move shows the full force of the transgender movement. It now allows passport holders to bypass identifying as male or female and mark X instead. Author Abigail Schreier called the change one of the clearest indications that gender ideology has infiltrated the highest levels of government. The X designation a concession to people who identify as transgender or intersex, those born with both male and female characteristics.
I'm an intersex person, and I had rights as such.
The first person to receive the new passport, Dana Zim, an intersex activist in Colorado. State will now allow anyone to select male, female, or X on their passport, with no medical certification required. It also plans to push other governments to offer the three gender options, a move activists applaud.
And I am hoping that this will, as soon as possible, become routine. The move a challenge to those who hold biblical beliefs about sexuality.
They're putting the stamp of human rights on people's thoughts on what is moral when this is actually immoral.
At the same time, Republican-led states are pushing back against transgender activism. This week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill requiring public school athletes to compete based on their biological sex. 5 other states have passed similar laws. And new research is raising questions about transgender medicine.
I think it's heartbreaking that some of these young people didn't get the evaluation, the support, the kind of mental health services that they needed.
In a peer-reviewed study, Dr. Lisa Littman found that the majority of those who reversed their decision to change genders reported they did not receive adequate evaluations from medical providers before they started to transition. Heather Sells, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Heather. Well, turning overseas, Palestinians in Gaza are protesting an agreement that restores U.S. funding to the UN agency that supports them. In July, the Biden administration signed a deal to resume funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees after the Trump White House cut it off. The agreement calls on UNRWA to make sure U.S. funds won't go to help any refugee receiving military training from guerrilla-type groups or anyone who's engaged in terrorism. It also calls for monitoring Palestinian school curricula for anti-Semitism. Palestinians say the agreement violates their rights. Now UN Watch, a watchdog group, is calling on UNRWA to identify employees it recently suspended because of ties to terror groups like Hamas. The agency reportedly suspended at least 6 employees accused of anti-Semitism and incitement against Israel. Former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danone, told CBN News UNRWA no longer serves a useful purpose.
I think it is about time to dissolve UNRWA. We have seen the incitement in the past. We have seen the curriculum in the UNRWA schools. And we have seen the collaboration with Hamas terrorists in Gaza. So I think, every once in a while you will hear those reports. I think for the long term, it is about time to replace UNRWA.
And this as UNRWA faces a budget crisis. The agency will host a conference for donors next month looking to raise $800 million a year for the next 3 years. Gordon, I know that you have been warning against UNRWA for quite some time.
Yes, the agency needs to go away. It was established back in 1948 to take care of the Arabs who voluntarily left Israel. I underline that. They were told by the neighboring Arab countries, the countries that surrounded Israel, to evacuate so they wouldn't be collateral damage. Because when Israel declared its independence, those countries declared war. And so they're not war refugees because of what Israel did. All Israel did was declare its independence. They were refugees because of what the Arabs did. So here we are more than 70 years later, and they're asking for millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to continue, quote, supporting the refugees, close quote. Well, it's now in the 5th generation since 1948. At some point in time, they have to get real about, okay, can we now live in Lebanon? Can we now live in Jordan? And can we ever form a Palestinian state? They always refuse to do it. And why is that? Because their ideology hasn't changed since 1948. Their ideology is to drive Israel into the sea. They have no tolerance for Israel. They have no tolerance for the Jews. So here comes our State Department saying, well, we want to help people, and so we're going to sign this agreement. And in the agreement, we have zero tolerance for anyone who's going to be part of a terrorist group. We're going to have zero tolerance for anyone teaching children and teaching hatred and incitement. Okay, so that's their policy. That's what they signed back in July. So here we are in October, and what happens? Well, UNRWA's looking for money, and the UN Watch, they came in and evaluated social media posts and statements by teachers who are teaching children in these refugee camps and in the Palestinian areas. They're the ones teaching. What are they teaching? Well, 3 of them identified by UN Watch are teaching that Hitler is a hero. And this is what they're instructing the children. Another one was teaching that we should kill Jewish boys. Another one was teaching we should kill Jewish rabbis. So where is the zero tolerance? UNRWA, the UN Watch identified over 100 employees who were doing this kind of activity and publicly proclaiming anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiment. And UNRWA says, well, we're going to suspend 6 of them. And that shows how much we're enforcing our zero tolerance. But here's the kicker. They're being suspended with pay. So what are you and I as U.S. taxpayers doing? We're funding that. We're paying them. And so much for the zero tolerance. Here's a bright idea. Let's get Ben & Jerry's to ban ice cream at the State Department, and maybe they'll get some sense and say, well, our tax dollars shouldn't go to support this anymore.